This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today is Wednesday, and that means it's time for the 50th edition of Deck History. In this series, I trace the history of prominent Magic archetypes from their origins to the current day. As usual, I ran a poll last week that gave you, the viewers, the chance to determine the topic of this week's video, and in the end, Enchantress Decks beat out Alurin. If you want to have a say in the topic of the next episode in this series, don't forget to vote in the Community tab. Enchantress decks originally got their name from Argothian Enchantress, a creature who draws you a card every time you play an enchantment. She also has Shroud, so you can be fairly confident she'll stick around and keep drawing you cards. An Enchantress deck seeks to gain massive card advantage from this kind of trigger, usually finding a way to lock down the opponent with enchantments and then also winning the game in one way or another with enchantments. For the purposes of this video, we aren't only going to discuss decks with Argothian Enchantress in them, although most of them do, but I am going to limit things to decks with low creature counts and cards that draw you a card when you play enchantments. This means I won't be covering something like Bogles, which are more aggressive enchantment decks, but if you're interested in learning more about that deck, I have already covered them in this series. At one time or another, Enchantress decks have been relevant in Legacy, Historic, Extended, and Modern. In this video, we'll take a look at Enchantress decks in each of those formats and talk about how and why they've changed over time. We'll start with a look at Extended, the first format where an Enchantress deck finished in the top 8 of a major event. Extended is a now-defunct rotating format that featured the last several years of Magic releases. While Enchantress decks had existed on the fringes of Extended for quite a while, they didn't really make an impact on the format until Motokiyo Azuma piloted his Enchantress deck to a first-place finish at Grand Prix Hiroshima in 2003. It was something of a rogue deck in the format at the time, and no one was really prepared to contend with it. The core of the deck was, of course, what we're calling Enchantress effects, which appear on Argothian Enchantress, as well as Enchantress's Presence. Really, it was the printing of Enchantress's Presence in Onslaught that had enabled an Enchantress deck to finally find significant success in Extended. Argothian Enchantress had been around for a while, but another card that draws you cards when you play enchantments was really needed for a deck like this to work, and Presence provided that. The deck was, of course, loaded up with lots of enchantments, including some that ramped your mana, like Wild Growth, Fertile Ground, and Exploration. Motokiyo's deck was combo-oriented, and once it had drawn a bunch of cards and populated the board with a whole bunch of enchantments, it could use Serra's Sanctum, Cloud of Fairies, and Words of Wind to produce a ton of mana. Words of Wind let you replace a card you would draw by making both players return a permanent to their hand, so every time you played an enchantment with either Enchantress effect in play, you could pay 1 and return something to your hand. Generally, this would be Cloud of Fairies, which you would keep casting, so that you could untap your Sanctum and make more mana. You could also return enchantments to your hand, so you could continue to chain together card draw triggers. Even without Winds or the Cloud of Fairies, you could generate a ton of mana. If you had Exploration and Trade Routes in play, you could tap it for mana, return it, play it, and then do it one more time in the same turn. After using the Sanctum to produce a ton of mana, the deck would use Living Wish to search up Ambassador Loquatus from the sideboard, at which point you would mill your opponent's entire library with all that mana. As we'll see, not all Enchantress decks are combo-oriented, some of them are, but they do tend to vary in how they win the game, as we'll see throughout this video. This was the only time an Enchantress deck found significant success at a major extended event, but there would be Enchantress decks in several other formats over the years, including in Legacy, where Enchantress decks have found the most consistent success over the years. The first time a Legacy Enchantress deck did well at a major Legacy event was 2007, when Luis Scott Vargas played an Enchantress deck during the Legacy portion of Worlds that year. Unsurprisingly, you will once again see that Argothian Enchantress and Enchantress's Presence are in the deck, as are several cheap enchantments that ramp mana, like Utopia Sprawl and Exploration. Beyond that though, this deck is quite a bit different different from what we saw 4 years earlier in Extended. LSV's deck had more of a prison element, and that is something that has remained fairly consistent in Enchantress decks over the years. The deck uses enchantments to lock down the game, like Elephant Grass, Solitary Confinement, Moat, and City of Solitude. The first three make life very difficult for creature-based decks. Confinement was particularly sweet in the deck because skipping your draw step wasn't as big of a deal as it would be for most decks. This is because you drew so many cards during your turn anyway, thanks to your Enchantress effects, so it wouldn't be hard to keep Confinement in play indefinitely, even if you aren't drawing during your draw step. Meanwhile, City of Solitude allows you to ignore your opponent during your turn, which is always nice. The deck also uses Sterling Grove, which gives your enchantment Shroud, and can also tutor up enchantment cards that you need. This allowed the deck to play a lot of singleton copies of cards, including win conditions, and various lock and hate pieces. Replenish also played a major role in the deck, because it could allow you to get back every enchantment in your graveyard, and put it on the battlefield. This made the deck incredibly resilient and hard to beat. The main way this deck could win the game was with Sacred Mesa or Words of War. The Mesa could spit out a whole lot of creature tokens, especially with the ramp provided by your various enchantments and Serra's Sanctum. Words of War, meanwhile, could allow you to replace cards you draw by doing 2 damage to any target, and this could do a ton of damage in a single turn because of how many cards you could draw. From this point on, Enchantress decks have been a fairly consistent presence in Legacy, though they have never been a deck you should expect to see at every event. The deck would really not undergo significant change over the next several years. By 2011, the deck did have access to a new, powerful win condition, Sigil of the Empty Throne, which largely replaced Sacred Mesa, as it was a great fit in a deck that looked to cast several enchantments in a single turn, which would now also produce an Angel Army. By 2012, the deck still hadn't undergone any major changes, but one notable difference is the inclusion of Emrakul the Eon's Torn. This version of the deck leaned a little more into its ramp plan with Serra's Sanctum, and it could power out the powerful Eldrazi pretty effectively. The 2012 version of the deck also ran some other cards we haven't talked about, like Humility and Miri's Guile. Humility could allow you to shut down a whole lot of problematic creatures, and Guile could allow you to reorder the top 3 cards of your library every single turn, which certainly improved your card quality. By 2015, the deck had changed a bit more, largely as a result of Theros Block, which featured an enchantment theme. The biggest thing is the set gave the deck access to another Enchantress effect in Eidolon of Blossoms, and this Enchantress was also an enchantment, so you could tutor it up with Sterling Grove. This deck began using Green Sun Zenith, which could be used to find an Enchantress, or it could give you a Dryad Arbor on turn 1, which was some pretty serious ramp. The deck also had a combo as one of its win conditions. It could use Helm of Obedience and Rest in Peace to mill the opponent's entire library. When the Helm is activated, it looks for one of 2 requirements to be met. Either X cards have to be put into the graveyard or a creature does, but with Rest in Peace in play, none of those cards go to the graveyard ever, so it just keeps milling. Enchantress decks pretty consistently looked like this over the next several years, and even by 2019, the deck still only looked a little bit different. This version of the deck runs Doomwake Giant, which could be used pretty effectively as a one-sided board wipe in the deck. Estrid's Invocation was a newer card that could be used to copy any of your enchantments, and it came with the useful ability to choose a new enchantment every turn if you wanted to. But still, this version of Enchantress does not look drastically different from where we started in Legacy 8 years earlier. However, that would change in 2021 when Legacy Enchantress decks finally got a significant makeover. The biggest addition to the deck was a brand new Enchantress from Modern Horizons 2, Sithis Harvest's Hand. She didn't come with Shroud like Argothian Enchantress did, but she did also gain you life when you cast your enchantments, which is a pretty nice upgrade to an Enchantress trigger. It now meant Legacy Enchantress decks had 12 effects that drew you a card when you played an enchantment between Sithis and the old standbys of Argothian Enchantress and Enchantress's Presence. Sithis is also an enchantment herself and offers a pretty big upgrade from the Eidolon that was run before. Destiny Spinner also gave the deck a pretty sweet upgrade. While it wasn't an Enchantress exactly, it did some pretty useful stuff for the deck. It made your creature and enchantment spells uncounterable, which was incredibly useful. It also provided a useful activated ability that could actually win the game sometimes, as animating lands into huge creatures is pretty sweet. Lastly, On Thin Ice gave the deck a 1-mana Oblivion Ring effect, with the only requirement being that you needed to run Snowlands. Legacy Enchantress decks still look very much like this today. Now, let's take a look at Enchantress decks in Modern. Before 2021, Modern just didn't have the cards for an Enchantress deck to be a thing. There was no Argothian Enchantress, no Enchantress's Presence, not enough good prison enchantments, and not enough good ramp. Modern Horizons 2 changed pretty much all of that, with a collection of both new cards and reprints that seem to have had the goal of making Enchantress decks competitive in the format. First, it provided 2 Enchantress effects, including Sithis Harvest Hand, which we just saw, and a modern legal reprint of Enchantress's Presence. Modern Horizons 2 also reprinted Solitary Confinement and included the brand new Sanctum Weaver. While it isn't quite Sarah's Sanctum, it does a pretty good impression, and it even has Sanctum in the name. Sterling Grove also got reprinted in Modern Horizons 2, providing the deck with important protection for its enchantments and giving the deck a nice tutor. There is one important card in the deck that is not for Modern Horizons 2, and that's Hallowed Haunting, which was the main way the deck won the game. It churns out a spirit token every time you cast an enchantment, and once you have 7 or more enchantments, they also gain Flying and Vigilance, and getting to 7 enchantments isn't much of a challenge for this deck. Enchantress decks are far from being a mainstay in Modern right now, but they are definitely around, and they have the potential to get even better. Now, let's close things out with a look at historic Enchantress decks, which first showed up in the format in 2021. We just saw that in Modern, Wizards of the Coast really tried to push Enchantress decks in 2021, and they did the same thing in Historic, with various historic anthologies providing many of the same cards, including Sanctum Weaver, Sithis, Sterling Grove, and Enchantress's Presence. While there was no Solitary Confinement, there was 9 Lives, which played a similar role, and could even be comboed with Solemnity to have its effect last indefinitely, creating a pretty powerful lock. The deck got better with the release of Kamigawa Dynasty, a set that had an enchantment theme. These days, historic Enchantress decks look like this. Jukai Naturalist was the deck's biggest addition from Kamigawa, as it decreases the cost of your enchantments, allowing you to chain even more of them together as you rip through your deck. Like in other formats, Enchantress decks aren't exactly dominating Historic, but they are definitely around, and it feels like another enchantment-heavy set might push the deck into a higher tier. So that's the history of Enchantress decks. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future editions of this series, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on the almost 50 other episodes of this series, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.